Okay, so with all that basic material around sort of the core notions of the unconscious, the collective unconscious, and now the notion of archetypal image, and complex, basically in place. And we'll be talking more about this stuff, and obviously this will be expanded by your readings. The next thing that I want to talk about is, in some sense, the specific structures, okay, that Jung proposed. Now, one of the reasons, I think I mentioned, that I prefer to use this diagram rather than other diagrams is that I like the specific way that it presents some of the core structures within the Jungian psyche in dyadic terms. Okay, so it's useful to think of these things often in pairs, okay, having a certain tension between them, right? So, one pair that we'll start by talking about is ego and shadow. Another is, right, persona and contrasexual soul image, what I'll often shorthand as soul. Okay, so it's animus and anima. And then also we'll talk about sort of the general psyche and the self. And we'll try to connect those things together. That sense of dyadic pairs, of pairs that are in a complementary tension, so complementary, like they complement each other, okay, is also going to deeply inform as we start talking about functions, okay? So our notion of functions is also going to be impacted by that, and I suspect that probably within this lecture I will touch on both. That is also part and parcel of what I want to sort of get into on the discussion board for this week. So, okay. So let's just jump into it. So if we refer once again to the diagram which I've been mentioning. Okay. So one interesting thing to consider in the respect that we talk about is, and this is more a subject for next week, but the Jungian concept of individuation, okay, individuation. So when Jung talks about individuation, or when people talking about individuation, what they mean at some level is becoming an individual, right? So it is about becoming your own unique self, okay? I feel like your own best self is maybe a bit value loaded, as we'll see, but definitely your own unique self, becoming more you, okay? That is essentially the process of individuation. Now, one of the things that people are mistaken about, I think, when they consider the concept of Jungian individuation, is just to think of it as a process of synthesis, which is to say that they think that it's just about sort of integrating with or absorbing all of these other components into your psyche, right? And that's not true. It's not accurate. It's not just about like integrating the shadow. Yes, right, there's sort of shadow and ego work involved, and you are doing work where you are integrating material from the unconscious into your conscious, but it's not as simple as just absorbing everything and then being an indivisible whole. That is not an accurate portrayal of individuation. We'll talk more about that next week. A better way to look at it is that what you're doing is altering your relationships to these other components by making them more conscious, okay? And you'll see that plays really closely to the theory around dissociation. And so those of you that have taken my course on NEW302 on hypotheses of the unconscious know that structural dissociation and neo-dissociative theory are an area of study for me, and something that is closely related to my theoretical work around consciousness. And you will see that the dissociation stuff, when we get talking about it, is really, really important to some of the concepts. But again, a lot of that is some stuff we'll deal with next week when we're talking about projection and more about individuation and sort of the way the work occurs. Anyway, the point is that with individuation, you're not becoming indivisible. You are forming different kinds of relationships between the parts of yourself that are in some way sort of harmonizing them, right? Bringing them into their proper relationship with each other so that you as an individual paradoxically recognize that you are not individual at all, that in fact you are very much dividual, but in so doing, you're sort of sorting yourself out by acknowledging that fact. Okay. So when Jung talks about individuation is not a set program, okay? It's not like first you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and then you're done, okay? It's also not a terminal process. It's a mistake to think that individuation is sort of like enlightenment. It's like you achieve it and then you're done. It's not like that. This is a lifelong process you're talking about. And it is for a bunch of reasons it's non-terminating. It doesn't end, okay? However, although there is no guaranteed, set process to it, and although it is non-terminal, Jung sometimes shorthanded the stages of individuation by saying this. He said, first comes the apprentice piece, and the apprentice piece is the shadow, okay? Then comes the journeyman piece, and the journeyman piece is the animus and anima, okay? The contrasexual soul image, what we'll often call the soul, okay? And then lastly comes the masterwork or the masterpiece, and that's the self, okay? This is sort of the great work. Now, in the midst of that, this is not going to be a strictly linear process, right? So shadow work, frankly, never stops, right? And in the middle, there are lots of other archetypal encounters that people are going to have, and that's a unique process with every analysis and every individual to some extent. However, when we think about things with sort of those three stages loosely, okay, step 1, shadow work, step 2, soul work, step 3, self work, it helps lend a little bit of structure. And so I think that's useful to bear in mind, and then you can kind of complexify from there. But if you think about it as a 3-act structure around those things, I think that'll be quite helpful. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about these components in sort of that relevant sense. So first thing first. Ego. Let's start with ego. So I'm going to flip back. I'll consult this diagram periodically, but I don't think I need it at this exact second. Okay, ego. What's ego? Ego is you. It's pretty much that simple. Ego is your conscious self. It is your experience of consciousness and awareness of who you are. That's the ego. Now here's the thing with the ego. One, the ego tends to mistake itself for sort of the totality of the show, as it were. The ego often thinks it is the mind, which, for reasons that I pointed out last week and we'll get into in ongoing detail, is absurd. It's preposterous to think that the ego is the sum total of the mind. But the ego is used to thinking that way, and that tells you a lot about it. The ego, furthermore, generally thinks that it's the boss. It thinks it's in charge. It thinks it's running the mind. Now, if you have a little bit of exposure to psychology or cognitive science, right, or even to economics theory for that matter, you will rapidly recognize that the ego is not running the show. That, yes, there are cases where consciousness seems to be sort of involved in processes, but a lot of the time what it does is confabulate a story about what you're doing after a process is initiated, right? So the ego loves to think it's in charge. So I am reminded here of the father-in-law of a fellow that I worked with. And the father-in-law of this fellow once declared at a Thanksgiving dinner, "I'm the boss of this meal." Okay, now if you think about that for a second, that's odd, because meals don't have bosses. I'm the boss of this meal. Okay, I'm the boss of this meal could very easily be a statement that's routinely attributed to the ego. It just thinks it's in charge of everything in often a frankly tiresome fashion. So it takes credit for things that it shouldn't take credit for. It thinks it's in charge of things that it isn't. And necessarily, because the truth frequently gets through to it, it's deeply insecure. And it will react accordingly and defensively. So, like, sometimes the evidence gets through that the ego realizes it's not the boss of this meal. And if that comes up, it often gets panicky, insecure, reactive, defensive, right? Defense mechanisms jump into play. Now, that isn't to say that the ego isn't important. As I pointed out when we were talking about the conscious and the unconscious, the ego has a unique role to play within the psyche, okay? It's consciousness that's important, okay? And indeed, bringing things into, like, within the purview of consciousness and allowing them to pass right into the boundaries of the ego, material to pass into the boundaries of the ego and to form relationships with the ego is much of the game of individuation, right? It's a lot of what's involved. Okay, so the ego thinks that it's the sole thing, or it thinks it's in charge. And the big way that this happens is that a lot of the time the ego, that is to say people, have the assumption that the ego is in some sense the center of the mind. It's the center. It's the pivot point. It's that around which, right, everything else concentrates, and it's the center of the system. And it isn't. In Jungian psychology, the proper center of the psyche is the self, okay? All the ego is the center of the conscious psyche, the conscious mind. But the considerably bigger unconscious mind has a different center, okay? And its center is the self. Okay, now, ultimately speaking, you'll see that when we're talking about Jungian individuation, right, it's about changing a relationship between ego and self. And the way that I like to talk about this is with the geocentric, heliocentric transition model. So, okay, so what's the deal with this? It's pretty simple, really. Okay, so you all know, of course, obviously, that people once upon a time, thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and that the sun went around the Earth, right? Pretty simple. And I'm speaking here in sort of Western European terms for shorthand, but generally speaking, that was a cultural assumption of most peoples in most places, and it's still a cultural assumption in some places. But let's speak within the Western framework for a minute, because that's really where Jung is coming out of. So, okay, so we begin with a geocentric model, right? So the geocentric model has the Earth at the center of the system, and the sun and everything else go around it. Now, it was not unknown to people that there were alternate schemes to describe the way that the solar system worked, okay? So, contrary to what you sometimes hear about, the canonization of Galileo as some kind of great martyr for science against the church knew about the concept of heliocentrism, right? The concept that the sun is in fact at the center of the system. This idea goes back to the Pythagoreans, okay, in ancient times, and indeed the church labeled it as such. They called it the Pythagorean hypothesis, the idea that the sun is in the middle. But it was not sort of widely adopted, right? By and large, people stuck with this geocentric thing. Now, that persists, okay, this geocentric notion of things, until you start trying to undertake finer and finer and finer calculations, basically, of the stars. Okay, and of course, calculating the heavens occupied a tremendous amount of the early resources of humans, right? For instance, we look back as far as Göbekli Tepe, right, which is a Turkish site, and it is fully, I think, 5,000 or 6,000 years earlier than the earliest human habitation stuff like construction that we find previous to that. So, we used to think that the cradle of civilization was in Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent and all of that with the Sumerians and the Babylonians. And now, actually, we find this site that is much, much earlier in Turkey. And Göbekli Tepe, as far as I can tell, is a temple. That is to say that people didn't farm there, and they didn't live there permanently. But when you go look at this thing, I recommend take a look at it online. What you find is this enormous religious site full of huge carven stones and stuff. And a big function of it, like many of these sort of early religious sites, is it's astronomical, right? It's designed to do star measurements and predictions. It has calendrical functions. Now, in a way, if you think about this sort of makes perfect sense, right? Because consider in a pre-scientific framework what it is like, right, for early humanity to experience the world. There are clearly two realms in some sense that appear to obey quite different laws, okay? Three realms in some ways. Okay, so one is the Earth. And when you look around at the Earth, what is it? It's a realm of change and rapid change, right? People are born, they grow, they mature, they reproduce, they grow old, they die. And the same thing is true of animals, and the same thing is true of trees, and the same thing, right? It also has changeability in terms of the seasons, which follow a cyclical pattern, right? These things appear to have cycles. They repeat, but nevertheless, like time is the order of the day, right? Seasons change, organisms change, locations change, right? Weather is changing, change, right? You know, somewhat cyclical, but nevertheless, right? This kind of fashion. Okay, and then mid-range, we get sort of the sky, right? And the sky is highly changeable, but also inaccessible. But then above that, importantly, okay, are things that appear to be changeless. There are some features of the world that also appear to be changeless, mountains, for instance, right? Which appear to be effectively eternal to a human being. It's like they're there, but they're touchable. Then there's the sky. And the sky, yeah, it does go through changes, especially in the day, but then consider the night sky. The night sky is just these like motionless points, very mysterious, at a great distance, right? Now, if you pay really close attention, you'll see that actually the starscape gradually changes. And it not only changes throughout the year, but in fact changes, right, over longer periods of time. And the ancients knew this well. And the fact that they knew it well, given how hard it is to notice that and calculate it, tells you exactly how much effort they were putting into looking at it. But in other ways, it's a pretty eternal realm. Effectively speaking, we're looking at the same Big Dipper constellation as they were looking at 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, right? Like, think about that. Things are a little bit positionally changed, but like the change is so slow. And so what does that tell you? It tells you that the world down here is a changeable, mutable world, but the world up there is changeless, in some sense immortal, right? And that seems like a very fitting other world for gods, right? Okay. And that's interesting. But there are clearly changing entities, okay? Foremost among them, the sun and the moon. These things are obvious. You can see them from everywhere on Earth. They're about the same size, but they have different qualities. Sometimes they eclipse each other in different directions, right? And they're pretty predictable, right? You can predict. Eclipses, as it turned out, were much harder for people to predict. But, you know, sunrise and sunset, easy to predict through the year, and people did, right? So you look at various monuments in the ancient world, and you'll see that they have them set up so that when the sun comes up at a certain time of day, right, comes up for a certain time of day at a certain time of year, then the sun will come up so that it appears over such and such a stone and shines down, and right, this like Raiders of the Lost Ark stuff. But they really did that, and they had those kinds of fine calculations. Okay, so there's that. And then there's the planets and comets. Don't even get me started, but there's the planets. And the planets are complicated. Why? Well, the planets are complicated because it's a lot trickier to figure out their patterns of motion, to predict it. Because if you're looking at the planets, okay, they seem to proceed in a kind of arc, but then every now and then they reverse. They go retrograde, okay? And sometimes they're brighter, and sometimes they're further, and sometimes they move faster, and sometimes they move slower. Now, from our modern heliocentric position, we can sort of get a sense of why this is, right? There's a set of concentric orbits, and we're going through orbits too. So if a planet, right, if a planet, for instance, is relatively close to us in the orbit, and we're seeing it going by, light is shining on it, right? And of course, it appears to move more slowly because it's closer to us, right? Whereas if we see the same thing from far away, it's dimmer, but it's also covering more of the sky, right, in an equivalent amount of time because it's further away. So we can account for this kind of thing. Also, right, that accounts to some extent why it goes sometimes in one direction and sometimes in the other. If we're on the same side of the solar system, then it's going to seem to move one way, and if it's on the other side, it's going to seem to move the other way, right? Now, this is very noticeable, for instance, those of you who follow astrology to some extent, when you look at something like Mercury. Okay, and Mercury astrologically is in retrograde about 1/3 of the time, right, or something like that. I mean, it's not exactly that, but it's a lot. Okay, why? Well, Mercury is very close to the sun, and it goes around really, really quickly, right? It goes around really, really quickly, and so quite often it appears to be going backwards from our perspective. Now, it turns out that when you try to model that, when you really nail down and try to model it, you create this thing called an orrery. And an orrery is like a set of rings that you use to predict stuff. But if you put the Earth in the center of that system, okay, then getting accurate predictions of the movements of the stars becomes incredibly hard. Every time you think you've got it nailed down, no, you have to add another little ring, another little epicycle, because you're making this assumption. And the assumption is that it's the Earth, that everything else is going around. And it's not, right? It's not. So what happens? Well, in the real world, what happens is that Copernicus comes along, and Copernicus does a clever thing. Copernicus says, well, it's not, I'm not making a claim about reality here, he says, right, to keep himself from getting in a fight with the church, the same fight Galileo went looking for shortly afterwards. But it's not that I'm saying that it is this way. It's just that if you pretend it's this way, the math is easier. The math is easier. What's the math is easier? Well, it means that if you put the sun at the center of the solar system, when you're doing this, all of a sudden, it's a lot easier to calculate what the hell is going on. But to do that, you first have to give up, right? You have to give up the assumption that the Earth is at the center, right? You have to give up the assumption the Earth is at the center. You have to, in some sense, calculate its movements as if it is a lesser body in orbit around something bigger and more powerful than it. Aha. So this is the analogy that I like to use for what the process of the relationship between the ego and the self is. And we'll come back around to this. So basically, the ego starts out and it's egocentric, right? It believes that it is the center. It believes that it is the boss of this meal, right? And it looks up into the heavens, as it were. It looks into the psyche, and it can see the movements of all of these other bodies, but many of them are erratic. They seem erratic, right? So there are forces and features in the mind, and they're hard for the ego to track. But a large part of this is because the ego is assuming that these things are effectively orbiting around it, right? And they're not. They're not. Now, Einsteinian relativity notwithstanding, because actually the answer is that neither the sun nor the Earth are the center of the system. And we'll talk about that later when we get into things a little bit more heavily. But the point is this: in order to sort of make the math, right, of the solar system comprehensible, you put the sun in the center. In order to make the predictive, okay, power, right, of the Jungian system work, you put the self in the center. The Earth isn't the center of the solar system, right, when you're looking at it in the simplest terms. And the self, right, the ego isn't the center either. The self is the center. Now, is Earth important in the solar system from our perspective? Yes, of course. The fact that Earth isn't the center of the solar system doesn't make it less important, right? Because at this point, it seems like it's the only place we can live. Now, of course, like last week, we maybe found signs of life on Venus, which for reasons we'll touch on later is actually maybe not great news. It's good news in some ways, but in other ways it's nervous-making news. So we'll talk about that later, the great filter and what. Anyway, but, for our immediate purposes, right, the fact is there's just nowhere else to live. Yeah, the sun is the center of the system, good for the sun, but we can't live there. Now, the thing is, we can't live there, but we can't live without it either, right? So the sun, like the self, is the center and totality of the system. And Jung said this about the self. The self was the center and totality of the psyche. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, again, think about this in terms of the solar system. The sun, if you think of the sun as the center and totality, right? Well, it's the organizing principle of the system. Like the self is the organizing principle of the psyche. What does that mean? Well, imagine that I could click my fingers and make the sun vanish, right? Disappear. What happens? What happens to the rest of the solar system? It flies apart. It's not there anymore, right? Without the sun as a huge kind of gravity well in the center, right? Nothing else holds its orbits. The sun is the organizing principle of the solar system. Everything goes around the sun. In fact, in a way, all the planets are afterthoughts. It's the sun that's really what's happening, right? In an important way. If you remove the sun from the formula, the other planets, just with no gravitational, they fly off into space, right? Okay. Likewise, let's say that the sun, whatever, let's say the gravity is still there, but the sun's energy source vanishes, right? Well, then what? Well, then we're all dead. We're all dead. Everything in the solar system is dead, right? If we suddenly transmuted the sun into like a rock, well, it would probably turn into a neutron star or something, but let's not push this too far. The point is, if the sun suddenly stopped giving off light, everybody dies. There's no anything in the solar system. There's no meaningful life of any kind for us or anybody in the solar system if the sun isn't doing what it's doing, okay? So the sun is the center and in some sense the totality, okay? You could alter a bunch of other components of the solar system and, it would be basically the same. But if you take the sun out, right, that's it. It's over, okay? But we can't go live on the sun. And it's the same thing with the ego and the self. Recognizing that the self is the center of the system doesn't mean inhabiting the self. We'll talk about that when we talk more about the self, and we'll talk about the concept of inflation, which is very important. But I think it's good to talk about this early on to get this sense. The ego is the center of consciousness, but the self is the center of the psyche as a whole. It is a much, much bigger and more powerful kind of organizing force, okay? But the ego has a hard time with this, right? It's demoralizing. And any encounter between the ego and the self is inevitably humiliating to the ego. And what I mean by that is, like, the ego was very, puffed up, right? So to suddenly encounter the thing that is really at the center and that really is the organizing principle, and of which the ego is, ideally speaking, like a humble servant, right? The ego is humiliated, especially if it's already kind of fragile, as many people's are, right? Many people are struggling and continue to struggle for a sense of place, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. These are the things that Jungian psychology is intimately concerned with, right? And I want you to note, that's not just about you and your place in the world, right? Who am I? What am I going to do? What am I good for? What's the point of things, right? That's not just about you operating in the world. It's also about your ego within the overall structure and forces that constitute the psyche, right? Like, what is your role and position? What is the meaning of your consciousness relative to these other parts of your psyche? These are live questions, and this is a big part of what Jungian individuation is concerned with, okay? So, ego. Now, the old joke around ego a little bit, I don't know if it's an old joke. It's a joke I tell, but anyway, there's this classic joke, right? The drunk and his keys. So the drunk goes, loses his keys, and so then he realizes he's lost his keys, and he goes back and he's searching for them under a lamplight, like under a street lamp, right? And somebody says, like, well, is that where you lost your keys? And the guy says, no, but this is where the light's good. This is where I can see, right? Now, that's a principle that applies also, frankly, to lots of psychological self-inquiry. We start at the ego a lot of the time. We start within our conscious mind because it's where we can see. But you can see how that's a deeply misguided and misgiven idea about things. It's foolish a lot of the time to believe that the answer lies within your consciousness. Right? There are other motivating forces, unconscious forces, and those require attention and consideration. So, any given action, strictly speaking, to look at it in terms of its conscious, willed, informed agency is missing most of the picture, right? Incidentally, this informs some of my course policies. So not least, right, when I talk about, like, I don't consider procrastination to be some special, unique moral category. When it's like, you procrastinated, you need to deal with the consequences of your actions. It's like, no, it's a psychological issue. And because it's a psychological issue, why were you procrastinating? Was it like a straight up conscious decision? I'm not doing it. I doubt it. I very much doubt it. And so trying to call people to moral account for something that they don't actually have control over strikes me as absurd, right? There are many cases where we do not hold people to moral account unless we believe that they were really exercising agency and conscious agency. And my personal opinion is that conscious agency is a minority player in a large number of circumstances, and things need to be treated accordingly with a degree of compassion. That doesn't mean you let everybody do everything they want. There have to be rules, right? But it also means that you don't unnecessarily punish things that don't seem to actually have, you know, a conscious agentic root, okay? So, ego. We tend to look where the light is good. Now, what's ego good for? Well, as we'll see, you know, as we get deeper into the course, bringing things into the light of consciousness does have interesting effects. Not least, when we bring things closer to consciousness, the other parts and components of the psyche, the other complexes that we have and structures and so on and so forth, seem to take on some of the glow. So many of these things actually want access to consciousness. They're trying to get our attention. That's not uncommon at all. So let me give you a quick example. A client. He was a fellow in his 20s. He was kind of an obsessive science fiction fanatic fan. He had a big library in his basement. And he did not have very good relationships with women, right? And there was a sense in which he was sort of ignoring this and ignoring this. So he comes in and he has a dream. And the dream is that he's down in his science fiction basement. There we go, something in my eye. He's down in a science fiction basement and he's looking, and there's this really well-dressed woman with made-up nails and hair made up is trying to get his attention. He's ignoring her. He's just doing things. He's at the shelves. He's shelving stuff. He's ignoring her. And he's ignoring her. And then finally, she wheels, like spins him on, and she has like a monstrous witch face, and she claws him across the face. And he wakes up. Now, that's a dream actually that gets repeated several times. And as you'll see, repeated dreams then have a special kind of significance. Usually it means you're not getting it. If they have to keep sending you the signal, you've missed something, right? Sometimes it's emphasis, but yeah. Okay, so there's a few interesting notes here that we'll get into because we're about to touch on relationship between ego and shadow. One is that, like, this part of him that he's not in very good contact with, this feminine component, right, is trying to get his attention, and he won't listen, won't pay attention. He continues to be absorbed in what he's doing. He ignores it, and he ignores it. And this, as often as not, is how things are with complexes. They try to get your attention in various ways, but you don't want to hear it. And so they try, and they try, and they try, and when they finally can't get your attention, they start to act out. They'll behave in various ways. So in the dream, turning things up to nightmare, right, is one of the intensity modes that a complex will sometimes use to, right, get your attention because it's scary, right? It's like a jump scare in a movie. It's a way of dialing up your attention where it draws, right? And these things learn how to get your attention when they have to. But clearly that's a slightly maladaptive method. It's only doing that because it can't get your attention in another way. It's not succeeding in getting your attention elsewise. Other ways that you might see that happening, psychosomatic illness, okay, is a good one. Or psychological issues is a classic, right? So the complex is trying to express something. It's trying to get your attention. It's trying to get itself into the conscious sphere, and there's a sense in which you won't let it, right? You're like, no, you keep putting your boot on its face, pushing down, right? And eventually it's going to come back, often in a monstrous form, right? Across the face. Okay, so that a little bit, if we want to consider it, about the relationship to the ego. So now let's talk about the shadow. The shadow and the ego are in counterpoint. And what's the shadow? Well, the shadow is, we can say by definition, right? It is the shadow which is cast by the ego. If the ego is solid and accepted and in the light, it necessarily casts a shadow. Now, what are some things we can say about shadows and the objects that cast them? One, there's no way around it. If you're in a lit space, I guess if you got light on all sides or something, hypothetically you could avoid casting a shadow. But the point is, we expect that things do cast a shadow, right? This is why supernatural creatures sometimes don't, right? Sometimes vampires and things don't cast a shadow. It's because they're unnatural, right? Because they're not really a part of the world. They're intercategorical in some important sense, right? So we expect that things are going to cast a shadow and that it is a necessary sort of consequence, but almost a part of, right? The shadow is part of the object. They're always connected, right? They're always connected. And that's important too. So we'll talk in a minute about Peter Pan. So the shadow is intimately connected, but the shadow is also dark and flat. It's this absence of things. Okay, so what does this mean in the Jungian psychological sense? The shadow is composed of a few different things, okay? And we're going to talk about individual shadow and collective shadow. But the shadow is composed of a few different things. So the shadow is partly composed, okay, importantly composed, of the things which you have done that your consciousness won't accept as part of your ego. Remembering that your ego is your self-conception. So there are things that we have all done that we are not proud of, or that we're not happy about, or that don't fit into our idea about ourselves. I'm not that kind of person. But everybody has things that they've done in reality that don't fit in, things they don't feel good about, things that they're ashamed of, right? Things that they feel guilty about, or things that they just straight up cannot accept as part of their own self-image, right? Now, many people will have had the experience of having like a 2 a.m., have something haunt you, right? Where a part of yourself comes back and it's like, you did this thing and you're bad, right? Many people have had that experience. That is a confrontation with the shadow, an intimate confrontation with the shadow, where it suddenly gets brought face to face. And if you don't have a lot of sort of psychological control and experience in this domain, what it starts as a trickle of you're bad can become a flood, right? So here's everything you've ever done wrong. Here is why you are a horrible, horrible person, right? Now, the fact is, in many cases, we did do those things. We did them. Cruelty, right, where we were unnecessarily cruel, where we lied, where we did things that were against our self-image or against our beliefs, right? All of that stuff. If we can't accept it into our self-image, it gets tossed into the shadow and ignored and repressed, okay? In that sense, it's similar to the Freudian id. Okay, but that's not it. That's not all that's in there, okay? Now, one more thing about that. Also, sometimes things will go in there because we can't accept them into our ego. We can't accept them into our personal image about who we are, right? And yet they're sort of live things. So this includes things like traits that people currently possess that they find intensely aggravating in other people, right? And this is when we typically think of somebody as a hypocrite. But if they're genuinely unaware of it, and sometimes they are genuinely unaware of it, right? That's a projection. It's a shadow projection, right? It's something that's going on with them, right? But they cast it out of themselves, right? Oh, it's there. Oh, and if you're a neutral observer and you're like, but you do, and they're like, no, I don't, right? Sometimes you can break through and get someone to see that, and you'll watch. It's often right? So as an example, I had a business partner a number of years ago. I had a business partner a number of years ago who was often late, but he found other people's lateness annoying, and he couldn't acknowledge how often he was late. And so I kept track of it, And at one point I was like, well, you're late all the time. And he was like, no, I'm not. And I was like, yeah, you are. And he was like, no, I'm not. And I was like, okay. So on September 17th, you were 43 minutes late to this meeting, and and just kind of went through one after another and watched as this slowly dawning sense of horrific recognition, right? Well, that's him getting something from his shadow push its way back into consciousness because I'm forcing it there to some extent, right? Okay, so those two things that are part of you but that you've exiled, right? You don't care for. And the emotions that come with that kind of shadow work: hatred, fear, disgust, shame, bad feelings, a lot of bad feelings. That kind of shadow work carries a lot of bad feelings. If things are fully shadow rejected, okay, then often they can take on an enormous amount of power in the darkness, and we become terrified of them. So, something that we've pushed outside of our regular consciousness can take on this incredible looming status, right? As it sort of absorbs the power from the shadow, and can become terribly monstrous. And the thing is, a lot of the time, if you actually get closer to that stuff, loses that power. It's gotten that power because it's been pushed so far away from the ego. So classic thing, right? You teach kids to do in dream work when they're having nightmares, adults too sometimes, is you teach them like just enough lucid dream work that they can become lucid and conscious during their dream. And the idea is like they've got a monster, witch, or a troll or something that's been chasing them around. And the idea is they're supposed to turn around and talk to it, right? Instead of just running, instead of playing into the dynamic. Oh, it chases me, so I run because I'm afraid and it's trying to whatever. You turn around, which obviously requires some active courage, significant courage. But you turn around and you say, what do you want? And what you see over and over again is that the monster will transform into a less frightening form. And often it will communicate and it will say, well, I just wanted to talk to you. This is a known thing. This happens quite a lot. Well, it turns out that's sort of a visual, dream symbolic representation of something that's a general process when you're looking at shadow work. When you turn and accept it and face it and grow close to it, it sort of diminishes its monstrous power. It gains that power by being rejected, okay? I said I would bring this up. So a good example here is Peter Pan, okay? In Peter Pan, the story of Peter Pan, there's a sequence where they cut Peter's shadow off. Peter cuts it off. He's often sort of impulsive because Peter Pan syndrome, right? So he's impulsive. So he takes a pair of silver scissors and he cuts his shadow off at the feet. And then, interestingly, Peter gets sick, gets sickly, and the shadow goes running around on its own, okay? And they have to capture it, drag it down, and sew it back onto his feet. That's actually a pretty good model in a lot of ways. If we reject things completely from our psyche, they don't go away. They don't go away. They just dissociate, which means they move further from consciousness, which means you have less influence, less connection. It's not that they're not going to express themselves. They're just going to do it outside your conscious purview, and they're going to be furious, right? Because they want, generally, to be expressed through consciousness. They want to have a seat at the actual table and not be cast out as monsters. But if they get cast out as monsters, well then, by God, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. Like they'll become quite monstrous. Right? And that can express itself in your behavior, in psychology, and dream, and all kinds of things. Okay, so that's the first kind of shadow work, things that are cast out. What else is in the shadow? Okay, so the next kind of stuff that's in the shadow that I think is sort of important is things that used to be part of consciousness that you later threw away. Okay, and generally this happens as part of the process of developmental maturation, unfortunately. So a good example of this is, you're doing art or you're drawing or something like this, and an adult comes along and they say, why are you doing that? That's kid stuff. You need to grow up. And then you throw it away because you're like, it's time to grow up. Or, you're doing something, it's deeply meaningful to you. You're at a certain age where you're a little thin-skinned. And while you're doing it, a bunch of people laugh at you and it hurts. And then you're like, this thing is what caused me the problem. I'm going to throw it away because being liked and being a grown-up means not being this, and it gets cast into the shadow, right? So you throw it away. And sometimes you throw away perfectly good things. This is what Jung called, in some sense, the golden shadow. That when you go rooting around in the shadow, it's not all just gross evil, right? There is some gross evil down there for sure. There are things you've done that are straight up terrible, terrible things. Everybody's done them. And make no mistake, the shadow is non-optional. Everybody has one. If I meet somebody and I can't kind of pick up the outline of their shadow, it makes me nervous because I know it's there. It's just hiding, right? That actually freaks me out. So if you meet somebody and they seem to have no shadow at all, they have one. It's just a matter of looking for it, right? And odds are it's buried pretty deep, which tells you some things. It's like, okay, they don't seem to have a very balanced relationship to it in some way. In some ways, you have to acknowledge your shadow and recognize, we're human. That doesn't mean letting it run amok, right? Taking ownership and responsibility over the things that are in your shadow is not the same thing as fuck it, I guess whatever, anything goes. I'll be evil now. That isn't correct. But the point is that coming into conscious dialogue with it is a sort of developmental responsibility that we all have. And acknowledging that we all have shadow to us, that we've all done flawed, terrible, mean things, right? That we all have thoughts and actions that are less than exemplary, right? This is realistic, and it forms a balanced idea. When we have the idea that we must be good all the time, everybody has to think that we're good, and of course we're good, we're always good. Very unbalanced, okay? Very, very off-kilter, very off-center. Okay, so that's the outright sort of dark, but there's also this golden shadow. There's this other material. So it may be that we reach a place in our development where what we need to do is reach down into the shadow and retrieve some of the things that we threw away. That these can be life-giving elements that we forgot about, that we rejected, that still have a place at the table. We just have to bring them back in, right? And very often that's things like creativity. Many adults, for instance, lose an ability to play. And as you'll see as we go further into the course, an ability to play is indispensable, right? But we often give people the idea like, grow up, get serious. This is no time to be whatever. You need to be serious, right? No, don't be funny. Don't have a sense of play. Don't goof around. Don't, right? This is a disaster. Play is the living edge of the psyche, okay? And I'm going to say that again. Play is the living edge of the psyche. If you lose an ability to play, you're going to lose a lot of other things, like an ability to easily change, for one thing, right? But also, you're going to lose a lot of flexibility. So throwing these things away, artistic capacities, creative capacities, play, right? And anything else, honestly, don't throw things away. If you settle on this idea, I'm a this and not a that, I'm a this and not a that, right? Regardless of what stage in your development you're doing it, you're consolidating yourself, but really what you're doing is limiting yourself in an important sense. I'm the kind of person who X, so I'm never the kind of person who Y, right? No, don't. And that's shadow work. Now, it's easy to say that, and it's hard to do. There are some aspects of shadow that you can get at, and you can get at pretty readily. But there are other aspects people have strong resistance to because the ego is pushing back, because cultural modes are pushing back, because there's all kinds of parts of themselves that says, no, that's not done, right? No. That is not how you are. That's not the kind of person you are. But, you know, if you're doing shadow work, you encourage people to confront this stuff, to take ownership over things that they've done, right? Even if it doesn't sit with their own self-conception particularly well, but also to explore these avenues that either were abandoned or were never considered to begin with. Okay, so that's shadow. To some extent, okay? There is one more thing that's in shadow, right? That's the avenues that were never considered. These were the seeds that were dropped and never saw any sunlight at all. And those too are a source of growth because, right, it's where the low-hanging fruit of development is. You try something you've never tried, and all of a sudden, right, find out that there is an opening up and a blossoming in your personality, and that's often where the green edges are, again, right, where the fresh green shoots of development are. And remember, all this stuff is effectively developmental. It's about growing yourself as a person. And cultivating your whole being. Okay, one other aspect of the shadow we should talk about is the collective shadow. The collective shadow is, you know, well, it's the part of the shadow that is collective to humanity and resides within the collective unconscious as a whole. And it differs because it differs in magnitude. So it's important to recognize, okay, that at some level, you are capable of great monstrousness, right? That's the essence of the collective shadow. If you want to get a sense of this, all you have to do is go and look in any kind of depth at all, and this is hard to do, but you go and look in any kind of depth at all at the litany of atrocities that human beings have committed upon each other, right? Individually and in groups over centuries and millennia. And if you want to expand that out a little further, you know, look at some of our close relatives in the animal kingdom, like chimpanzees, right? Or even cute and cuddly and intelligent species like dolphins, who are frankly murderous and rapey, right? The point is, like, when you go, and people often don't want to, they find this depressing, they find it upsetting, they find it difficult, and it is. It is. If you really dig in on this stuff, it's atrocity. It will make you feel sick to your stomach. And it will make you, like, will shake your faith in humanity. Okay, but your faith in what kind of humanity? Your faith in humanity as a pure being that somehow has transcended all this stuff, and it hasn't. And ignoring it doesn't help, right? Steering away from it all the time doesn't help. So collective shadow work fundamentally rests in coming to grips and not just saying, well, that's them. I would never. No. If there's been a lesson around this stuff, it's that regular people under the correct conditions are capable of tremendous brutality, cruelty, right? I don't like the word evil, I'll be honest, but, right? Brutality, cruelty, right? Like terrible things humans can do to each other and in big groups. And they do with some regularity. It's not new. That's the collective shadow. You can boil it down and say, you too could be a Nazi. Okay, that's true. Now, I'm going to say something here, which is like collective shadow work is fine, but collective shadow work, in my opinion, is less important than personal shadow work. It's all well and good to recognize that you too could be a Nazi, but that's just not likely to come up all that often, right? And like, yes, it's important to do that work, but in terms of the basic work, if you really want to do shadow work, you need to confront the small potatoes darkness that is already in your being. And if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to confront the possibility of your being like, a Nazi guard or whatever. If you can't even confront that shitty thing that you did to your sibling, you're not likely to confront the soul-blasting darkness that is the possibility of, like hell on earth, right? Which is the kind of thing that the collective shadow is concerned with. So collective shadow work, it is important, but it is less important for individuation work, in my opinion, than the kind of individual work, right? And the two things really operate in tandem. You get to, collective shadow work. But if you start that and you haven't done any personal shadow work, what you're likely to do is say, oh my gosh, well, I would never. And then you're missing the point. Okay, so the shadow. And we're going to do like a whole more month on this, so I don't want to spend too much more time. Also, I'm eating up my minutes with furious pace. I talk too much. That's the problem. I talk too much. Okay, so next. The next pair that we're going to look at, so ego shadow. The next pair we're going to look at, right, is persona and soul, contrasexual soul image. So persona, very briefly, is your mask. That's what persona literally means. It means mask, right? It's your mask. So what's your mask? Well, your mask is the complex that you use to face outwards into the world. And it's a mediation. It's an interface. It's mediation. It mediates between your inner being and the outer world. But it mediates between them, which means that it's formed between them in this important sense. Well, what does that mean? Okay, well, first off, it means that you don't get to make all the decisions about your persona, typically. Many of those decisions are socially derived. They're formed out of expectation, right? So that can be a certain amount of cultural expectation. A lot of it is attached to things that you don't have control over and that may or may not form an integral part of your own self-image, right? So, when you're considering this, it's like how you behave and what your outer persona is like is largely cultural determined. If you've lived in the States or traveled to the States, Germany and Japan, those places, you'll find that the cultural persona is quite different. And people from each culture will often struggle in the other because the demands of the persona are so different. The way you are supposed to conduct yourself in the outward fashion, the mask you're supposed to wear. We also have lots of masks. So as I pointed this out already, nobody has a single mask, or if they do, often that's a sign that something is not entirely right? They have lots of masks. You have a mask you construct with your friends, probably different masks you construct with different friends. You have a mask that you wear with your family, a mask that you wear at school, a mask that you use for your relatives, a mask with, your lovers, a mask with your job. Like, you're going to have all these different masks. And notice that those masks become more developed, okay? Now, normally when we were talking, we would be in the classroom at this point, but I like to point out that typically there's like a student persona. You'll be aware of this to some extent, right? Having done a bunch of university at this point. So one of the big things that's really interesting, okay, about teaching university is I never have to scream at people to get off of their desks, right? That's something that in high school I had to deal with sometimes, and I think my sister in grade school, teaches grade school, has to deal with a lot. Why? Well, some of it is you have improved self-regulation, but some of it is, but self-regulation in what sense? Well, you know how to behave. You know what the appropriate standards of conduct are. You know who you're supposed to be. There's variation within that, okay? But basically, you construct a persona for school that is within certain parameters. How you behave in other conditions might be wildly different. So your persona. But notice also that the deeper you get into something, the more construction can occur. So with persona specifically, there's often a persona that is attached to a specific profession, right? Doctors have bedside manner, right? But really, doctors have a kind of professional persona. Lawyers too, right? Professions very often. There is a sense of what it is like you're supposed to behave as, right? Lawyers, it's even stronger maybe than doctors, right? But there's this idea about what the mask is supposed to look like. Now, people that have issues with their persona, very often, it's because either their persona feels like it fits poorly, or they've become too closely associated with it, right? Their ego is too close to the persona. It feels tight. So you can usually tell if you talk to somebody in analysis and you say, so who are you, right? And they say, I'm a lawyer, right? No, that's your job. You're not a lawyer, probably, right? Like you're lots of things. So, right, when people tend to express as a first line item their profession, that usually means they've become too close to their persona. And that can bind us because the persona, like an actual clay mask, can be, frankly, kind of inflexible and it can be oppressive. People find this too when there are externally imposed demands on their persona, socially speaking or by their family. There are expectations about who they're supposed to be, right? How they're supposed to behave, and they don't feel like it. They don't want to. They don't feel like it's really reflective of them. Every tomboy in the universe, right, has had this experience where, their parents are giving them the gears. Oh, wouldn't you just like to try a dress? Maybe people are more enlightened now, hopefully, one might think. But people try to cram people in certain boxes, right? And those boxes basically are the persona boxes, Same thing, other kinds of expectations. If any of you are familiar with the term manic pixie dream girl, okay? This is a particular kind of archetypal image that turns up around the anima, and we'll talk about this at greater length. But it turns up around the anima, and it's a trope within fiction. You'll see in a lot of movies. We'll talk about this more. But the point is, manic pixie dream girl is also a persona that gets projected onto women, never men. Always women. It gets projected onto women. And obviously, right, sometimes we lean into a persona, right? People project a persona onto us and we're like, okay, I'm gonna lean into this. Seriously, I'm gonna try it. This is the identity I want to try on, right? Fake it till you make it. And it is often the case that if men or whomever are projecting manic pixie dream girl, that the manic pixie dream girl in question finds that this is highly irritating after a while, and they don't want to because they feel one-dimensional. There is this limited expectation of them. Likewise, I had a friend once who always wanted to play straight man socially, and thus always wanted me to play fool. And most of the time, it was fine, right? Fool and straight man, it's a dynamic, right? I'm the wacky one, and when he's the serious one who gets to be like vaguely disapproving, and you're so crazy, and okay. But the point was, sometimes this pissed me off. Why? This is 20 years ago now, but sometimes this pissed me off. Why? Because I'm perfectly capable of being the straight man too. Sometimes I would like to be the straight man. Like, let's mix it up. But he couldn't play ball. He could only play straight man. He felt deeply uncomfortable with fool, but he needed fool. That's why he wanted that energy around, right? But he wanted to play the straight man, the serious straight man all the time. Now, most of the time I played ball because he was my friend and I liked him, right? But it was kind of monotonous. It became this one-dimensional social routine. And many of you will probably feel like there are social routines of this kind in your friends where you are expected to play a certain kind of role. You're expected to do a certain kind of thing, possibly in your family and possibly among your friends. That's your persona, feeling a little too tight. Now, sometimes also it's like you outgrow a persona, There was like a social construction you came up with for yourself, but now things have gone on. It doesn't really feel like it fits, but you're still trying to play the role. Or alternately, I'm sure you've encountered people who are trying to get a persona on, right? But they don't really have it yet. And so they feel, like they're trying too hard, right? Basically. Now, that's interesting, and we'll talk more about that, because that fake it till you make it zone of proximal development thing actually, as it turns out, is sort of integral to getting a persona up and then to transmitting those elements of the persona back into the ego, to changing yourself. So, like nobody is a lawyer to start with. Everybody is pretending. You can know a fair bit about the law, but you're still kind of just pretending. And this is where we start to touch on things like imposter syndrome, which, as you'll find out, many of you will have experienced, right? And what you will find out is it is massively more widespread than you would imagine, and in people who you would never suspect. And what the claim I will make is that imposter syndrome, in fact, is an integral part. You get imposter syndrome if you are developing. So it's actually a good sign, usually. Sometimes it's a sign you've overextended yourself with bullshitting. But even that actually is often a developmental good sign. So we'll touch on that too. Okay, so I talk too slow. That's what we've learned. That's the lesson. That's the lesson for today. I talk too slow, too fast, too much, maybe. Okay, but we went through the first two. We went through ego, we went through shadow, and we went through persona. Okay, so for my next lecture, we'll go through, it's weird because I got these 2-hour blocks. I'm used to having the full class, and I've limited myself to not overwhelm people. Anyway, for the first time next week, we will get into the counterpoint to persona, that outward, and we'll talk about soul, okay, contrasexual soul image, anima and animus. That's okay, because we actually need a fair bit of time to unfold that, and we'll talk about the self. Okay, the other thing we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, I thought I'd get to it today, but what do I know, is functions theory, which is another important part of this whole thing. So what I am going to do on the discussion board, as I mentioned, is I'm going to post up a link to the MBTI. Even if you've taken it before, take it again. Bear in mind that the MBTI is not an especially orthodox interpretation of Jungian function theory. It's a bit screwy, okay? Thing one. Thing two, we'll talk about this more, but thing two, bear in mind that in terms of its like, if you do factor analysis on it, the statistical issues in the MBTI are significant, okay? So it has some factor loading problems for those of you that are statsy, okay? Which means that it's not the best tool in the world, is what I mean, whatever the hell that means. It's not the best tool in the world, but it's interesting, and it does do a reasonably good job of picking out certain features so that we can talk about them in terms of Jungian function theory. So I'm going to post up the MBTI. I would like people to take the MBTI, but then also that'll be the discussion question if you want to talk a little bit about your experience, your MBTI type maybe, and then your experience of like how you think that is given MBTI, okay? And then next week, we're going to pick up with contrasexual soul image. We'll talk about the self. We'll talk about a few of the other archetypes, and then we'll move into functions theory and then transcendent function and go from there, okay? So make sure you check on announcements. I'm going to put up my announcement system, by today about how we're going to do the selections. I'm still working on that problem for the presentations, and I'll also be posting up that announcement from the Jungian Society. Okay, so yeah, we will do that shortly, and I will see folks at Thursday tonight at 6 p.m. Okay, good.